Hey everyone, welcome back into Antioch Tulsa's Relational Value. We are glad you're here with us today. We are getting into humble responsibility. This one is intense, kind of like circus fires. But I got my good friend Marissa. Marissa and Daniel moved here with us in June to be a part of building out Antioch Tulsa. So Marissa, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
We have just decided how cool we feel
Very cool.
being in a studio. Shout out to our awesome director, Jordan. He will not probably say anything because he can't, but uh, I don't think he's mic'd up. But hey, we are so glad you're here with us today. Getting into humble responsibility. This is a big one. It is not culturally, it's not built into us in our society, and so I feel excited about this one. But here's the definition: humble responsibility. It is we take responsibility for our words, actions, and attitudes in relationship. And so, Marissa, welcome. I would love to hear how humble responsibility has kind of been shaping you in the last 6 months as we have jumped into this thing that is Antioch Tulsa.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pieces that has stood out as we've kind of been deep diving this is just the revelation that, like, what am I really responsible for? And being responsible for myself only and giving the true responsibility to God for the things He's responsible for, mainly people, other people than myself, means that I get to now enjoy people in a much freer way. I'm not trying to control people. I'm really just in charge of how am I connecting to God and how am I responsible for how I'm loving people
Oh,
rather than how do I change people. That's
totally.
out of the picture now,
So basically, this will change your life if you do it.
for sure.
Me and Matt and I were joking. I mean, we've as a team talked a lot about traffic, but being responsible for your own attitudes when driving next to someone that is driving, in your opinion, less than the standard they should be, is a great indicator on if you're responsible for them or for you.
Basically, we could change the kingdom of God through traffic.
I think it's true,
I think it's possible.
obviously. Well, yeah, humble responsibility. So as we're looking at all these, obviously they filter through Jesus, and what we're discovering as we're putting these relational values into practice is that because everything starts and is centered around the person of God or the headship of Jesus, it then creates these environments in the body or in our relationships where we can host the kingdom of heaven.
Mhm.
And so I would love to hear before we kind of get into your own experiences, how have you seen this in Jesus, where he's been responsible for his words, actions, and attitudes, and maybe not of everyone else's?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's really important in humble responsibility is knowing your identity. Like that
Absolutely.
feels like a really big piece of this is that like who am I? How am I connecting to God? Who does he say I am? Who does he say he is? Those feel like really big important pieces of it. So I think one place I see Jesus operating in this really clearly is right after he's baptized and the Spirit leads him out into the wilderness. And it's this very clear process of kind of his identity being challenged in some ways, but him continuing to be rooted in, like, I'm a son of God.
Yes.
That's who I am. And that is what dictates my life. So I think I see his ability to be remain in that, and it seems like it comes from that experience really deeply, and then we see him continue to live that out over the course of his life, obviously. But
In the desert, in particular, circumstances weren't necessarily great either.
yeah, I'd say that's accurate.
So I wonder how many times we question who we are when circumstances are maybe less than ideal,
Yeah,
such as a bad day at work.
true.
Oh, God must not be who he says he is, and I must not be who he says he is. Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, how else have you kind of seen this in the life of Jesus as he's played out his identity?
Yeah, I think another clear moment is just that wrestle we see him deal with God in the Garden of Gethsemane. Like really coming to this place of, I think, just his place of saying like, man, what am I trying to say? He is revealing that his choice is one of going to the cross, not out of like compulsion or demand, but I think we really see him reveal that he knows what he's going to do out of the sake of being connected to the Father and then ultimately having true connection with us. So I think that just shows this really beautiful picture of like Jesus is not a victim to anything. He knows what he's choosing and what he's owning, really.
Yeah, even to the point of death.
Yeah.
And it puts in the context a consistent attack on Jesus to try and expose him, where there was never a moment where he frustratingly responded like flippantly. He always chose to be responsible for his own words, actions, and even his internal attitude, where he didn't allow the frustration of people trying to contort him into something to define the relationship. But he chose to bring himself and relate to those people in humble responsibility, as opposed to maybe letting them know what he thought of them, which we've never done.
Never.
Not even once. Well, how would you say this is played out in your life in the last 6 months, maybe in some of your relationships?
Yeah, and even like going back even further in my life, I think and growing up especially, really that like picture of treating relationships like I'm a victim was very present in my life. Like everyone else is responsible for my feelings. Everyone else is responsible for what I'm saying, even in conflict or arguments. It's like if I'm reacting a certain way, it's because you did something to make me do that, rather than taking ownership of, regardless of how I'm being treated by someone, what am I choosing to bring back to the table in relationship. So I think as I've grown in God, this has been an area that he's kind of pinpointed over and over again. And really, again, from that place of discovering who God is and that he's really responsible for people. And even like he's responsible for like other people will have a face-to-face with God on their sin or their attitudes, their interactions with people, but I'm responsible only for me and what I'm interacting. Like I bring myself before God in those things. So I think especially in conflict, this has shown up a lot of just seeing the places where I'm once again having to choose to step back into relationship. Because I think when there's a wrestle in humble responsibility, it's easy in conflict to pull away, to build a brick wall of disconnection, or just kind of in apathy, just kind of coast. And I think I've felt challenged by God where he's kind of pulling me back in the game of relationship over and over again. And really that process of like repenting from especially apathy or fear of rejection, those kinds of things tend to disconnect me. Yeah. But choosing to believe God for what he has for a relationship is a big deal. So like that ability to like become self-aware, pull back with God, be like, what's going on in me? And then choose once again, like, nope, this is what I'm bringing to the table in relationship. And then owning, well, oh man, I disconnected. I've got to like own that part of it as I bring my whole self again.
Or even when someone has consistently chosen a behavior that in some way violates you, instead of just being hurt over and over and again and coping, I'm going to say something.
Yeah.
Because 98% of the time, they're probably not wanting to hurt you.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we just allow it and in some ways take on that kind of ideal of a victim because in some ways it's comfortable. It's like, well, this is just how this relationship will be and I'll just be fine. And then eventually you implode on the inside. Yeah. Which is not good. No, that's totally right. I think that idea of in our relationships, choosing to be just okay with fine, or it's just what it is, would be maybe some of the languages that I've adopted in relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Which ultimately, if you ask, okay, well, why? It goes back to I don't really trust God, and I don't actually believe that God's ways are best, in the sense of like that violated relationships are just the standard.
Yeah.
And you imagine, like, what if Jesus had modeled that?
Mm.
Like, it's just fine. The Pharisees are just what they are, and I just kind of try and ignore them.
Mm.
Like, what? Like, if Jesus had walked around with, constantly getting approached by cultural sinners and just been like, oh, this is so exhausting. I just always am dealing with hurting people. Like, if he had carried himself that way,
Yeah. Yeah.
as opposed to been responsible,
Mm.
be a very different
Yeah.
gospel.
Yeah.
I don't know if it'd be that powerful. um, looking, I guess, more specifically into our culture, if we, I guess, in our little community at Antioch Tulsa, or in our pockets of people at work, your coworkers, all of us are in these little spheres of 10 to 20 people. What would shift in these pockets if collectively we all chose humble responsibility?
Oh man. I mean, I think, gosh, I think it would change so much because we would truly bring our full selves to the table, I think, and be able to have some of those hard conversations. I think, again, like, I think so often, especially in a work setting, tend to encounter like someone gets hurt by something and just starts to usually gossip or complaining is most of our work cultures
Totally.
instead of like an attitude of, well, I'm here and I'm going to bring my full self. I think especially the attitude, like looking into how we engage with what's before us. Like, is it an attitude of like, this stinks, I'm barely showing up here.
Wah, 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 wah,
Yeah,
wah. Yeah.
like everyone's against me. I'm doing everything, nobody's helping. Like that tends to be a lot of our attitudes
Yeah.
about things. And so I think if everyone was operating in humble responsibility, you'd see the beauty of a lot of that getting worked out and going back to, well, really, God, what do you say about my work? What do you say about this person in front of me? What do you say about what I'm here to do? And it
Yeah.
would mean a huge change.
Yeah. It would almost be enjoyable.
Yeah. Dare I say, enjoyable?
Well, I think on the other side of like kind of the victim piece, when you're on the other side of that, if you're taking your responsibility for yourself, then everyone around you is just like a bonus.
Yeah.
Like it's like, well, I'm just responsible for me. Like, oh, and you're here? This is awesome. Like it's like, we were talking earlier, it's almost like every person is the goodness of God in a gift form that I get,
Yeah.
because I'm not like a victim to circumstances.
Yeah.
And even as we think about these communities, it's like, wow, what would it look like if I perceived these 19 other people as gifts, or these are the objects of the goodness of God put in my life. Well, that object, or that person, I won't call people objects, but that person was kind of hurtful. It was just an opportunity to practice relationship and connection.
Yeah.
It's almost like it'd be kind of sterile if there was no tension.
Yeah.
Like, would we grow?
Yeah.
I don't know that I have a very good answer for that, but so as you put this into practice, like, what has been your experience, at least with our little posse at Antioch Tulsa, as you practice humble responsibility?
Yeah.
Like, what have you gotten from it?
Oh man. Well, I think kind of what you were just touching on is this element of when God really gets to be responsible for people, and I'm just responsible for me and what I'm bringing to the table, then people become a gift. And so I think that has been very clear over the last 6 months, especially. Like, man, I'm just here to enjoy people, and or people become like I'm engaging in relationship with the goal of connection, enjoying them, um, discovering who they are and their gifts and what they're bringing to the table, rather than being really focused on, well, how am I hurt? How am I not being seen or noticed? Or I
Yeah.
think those are some of those elements. Like, I have to be in me just being responsible for, like, oh, if I'm feeling missed, then I just get to share about that. And then in the process, we grow in connection rather than like relationship doesn't feel as scary.
Totally. And even when you bring yourself and someone chooses to respond in a way that continues to be hurtful, it's not on me to like
Yeah.
figure it out.
Yeah.
I risked, I was vulnerable,
Yeah.
and God's still good.
Yeah. I think it brings the lightness to relationship
Totally.
that God intends for us to have with him too. We've talked about that a lot. Like,
Yeah. And this is a whole nother conversation, but the idea of the pain caused in relationship being light
yeah.
in the sense of like, it's just what it is, as opposed to it's the thing that defines everything.
Yeah.
Like, pain does not have that permission like Jesus does.
Yeah.
And that is a challenging, vulnerable conversation when you're in the midst of real betrayal, hurt, disappointment, even your own shame.
Yeah.
Of like, oh, I did something, and so I'm going to withdraw.
Yeah. Totally.
Anyways, that's a whole nother conversation. I think as you describe it, like people as the gift, I've even perceived, here at Antioch Tulsa, we've got this life group, and, on any given night, 30 people will show up. And in the past, in church, you would almost perceive numbers as like, oh, these are the trajectory of growth. Is God here? As if 30 or 20 or 10 people define that. Like, no. He's responsible for himself, not me.
Yeah.
But it's also shifted, I think, my perception of people where I'm not needing things from people. Like, they're gifts
Yeah.
that I have gotten the opportunity to interact with. On an earlier episode, Robyn was talking about, like, which one was it? Submitted communication, like at the diamond. Like, I want to see their perspective or what they're bringing. And it's like in our life group, when people show up and choose to start doing a relationship inside of our community, it's like a gift that we all get a new aspect of that diamond, like a more full, perspective of God. And I think that's all rooted in humble responsibility.
Yeah.
Because when I'm responsible for them, it's
Yeah.
kind of up to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And man, I'm so thankful Jesus was humbly responsible for himself. Oh man, even in John 6, like when he gives his disciples permission to walk away. He's like, you don't have to be here. Like, ultimately knowing that it's not up to him. Like, it was because he was yielded to the Father. Just crazy to me.
Yeah.
Anywho, humble responsibility. So as we're sitting here and kind of like, okay, someone's listening to this and, hey, how do I practice humble responsibility? What's the starting line, so to speak, or what is a starting line for discovering this value? What would you invite them to do this week?
Yeah, I think one thing that's super important with humble responsibility is just that place of getting clear on your identity in God and what he says about you and what he says about himself. I think that's a super important place to start, and that can look like just simply asking him, who do you say you are today, God? What is yours and what's mine? And going from there, I think that is part of how he wants to lead us in this.
Yeah.
And then trusting him, like if he's saying, hey, I'm the provider, then he really gets to be the provider,
Ooh.
which is it'll rile us up inside a little bit, but I think that's a really good place to start.
That's awesome. So, in the practice of humble responsibility, let the starting point be asking Jesus this week, almost on the daily, if you would, hey, who am I and who are you?
Yeah.
And letting his word be the answer.
Yeah.
And not what you feel, what's around you, the perception of culture that says you should be this, 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 and this. You're 28, you should be this. You're 36, you should be this.
Yeah.
No, it's what he says goes.
Yeah.
Woo. Right on. Well, there you have it. Humble responsibility. Take responsibility for our own words, actions, and attitudes in relationship. Marissa, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for letting me be here.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode. Bye.